Was Caesar a good general? The answer is yes. There is no debate. But the eternal question is why he was a great general. In fact, the eternal question is why was the Roman army a great military force? Why do we constantly teach their ancient warfare tactics and the ones that beat them, in today's military schools? Well, to try and answer that question, we have to first look at how the Roman army functioned. I'll spend the first part of this video essay explaining how the Roman army was organized, and the second part looking at how specifically the Roman army functioned in action at the Battle of Alesia. So we should understand a couple of things about how Romans fought before we look at a specific battle. 1. What battles look like. 2. Important characteristics of Roman infantry. And 3. Roman army formations. So what did battles look like? Well, it wasn't quite like that. Most of the time, Roman battles were long standoffs between two armies with sporadic fighting and missile attacks, until another side broke and ran. These standoffs could be hours long, with writers like Vegetius claiming battles were around 2 to 3 hours. Caesar made it clear in one of his accounts of a battle in Ilerda that one battle with a couple of cohorts lasted around 5 hours. Even when fighting did break out, its soldiers were very cautious of how they fought and often used their shields to protect themselves. These quick bursts of intense hand-to-hand combat would end after one side got the worst of the engagement. After all, the primary goal of the individual soldier was to stay alive, and by limiting the amount of skin exposed to people that wanted to kill you, and limiting how much combat there is, the individual soldier can accomplish that goal. However, fighting could also be very short in nature. Livy explained that Roman enemies like the Ibera and Agrigentum gave way at the first shock or even before their battles took place. Some scholars have even suggested that these quicker battles were common during the late Republic era, right around when Caesar was general. Another important thing to understand about battles themselves were their casualty rates. While in Greek hoplite battles, the losing army suffered around 14% casualties, in Roman battles, the losing armies suffered around 50% casualties or captures. So now that we have established how the Roman warfare looked, we should look at how the Roman infantry functioned. One of the most famous characteristics of Roman infantry was their shock and awe tactics. Frontline legionaries would unleash a fury of projectiles to the enemy line to disorient them and then attack, creating a huge psychological advantage over the enemy. Roman military tactics were heavily influenced to increase psychological advantages. Another key thing to understand about Roman infantry was their mobility in battle. Deployment of troops allowed for great ability to move around in battle, giving the tactical advantage to the commander. Infantry could give ground in the battle either by choice or because they were actually being defeated without significantly disrupting the rest of the army on the field. We can observe in the battles of both Pydna and Sisophenae, the Romans were able to give ground to the Macedonian phalanx, but eventually drew out the phalanx into terrain where the other Roman infantry could attack the Macedonians' weaker flanks. The overall mobility in battle allowed for faster movement of troops and more fluid movement of infantry to suit the tide of the battle. However, some scholars have argued that such troop mobility could hurt the Roman military prowess, because a weak or bad emperor could misdeploy troops and cause massive damage. The lapse and perhaps most important thing to understand about Roman infantry was their morale. The Romans are considered to be one of the first military powers to truly understand the importance of mental strength and troop morale on affecting the outcome of battles. Caesar capitalized on the military morale and thinking and applied it to Roman fighting. He took the Greek military theories of intellectual model of combat and adapted it to a Roman culture and a Roman experience. Caesar also took the binary scheme of military morale and changed it into a 3-level method of thinking about combat to better accommodate the Roman ethos and way of thinking. Caesar's writings about war constantly show that survival was an important part of warfare, especially as a cultural norm. Now that we have established the important characteristics of the Roman military, let's review battle formations. Each legion had about 5,000 men divided up into 10 cohorts. Think of a cohort like a modern-day battalion, and each of the 10 cohorts had about 6 centurii, led by a centurion, and was composed of 60 to 100 men. The standard battle formation consisted of the cavalry protecting the flanks, and situated between them were 10 cohorts in 2 rows of 5. The cohort that was the most right of the formation had about 1,100 men and 30 cavalry, whereas the other cohorts had about 550 men and 60 cavalry. Behind them were 14 units of light infantry and reserves. However, the Roman army had 7 formations it could use, depending on the conditions of the battle. The first formation involved level terrain in a situation where a commander's wings are more powerful. The commander would use the reserves to reinforce the lines if the flanks were evaded by the enemy, and once the enemy's flanks were destroyed, the center of the Roman army could press forward. The military proverb says, quote, "A general whose troops are superior in number and bravery should engage in an oblong square, which is the first formation." The second formation was considered to be the best possible formation by some and took into consideration that the left wing could be substantially weaker than the right wing. Thusly, a commander beefed up his right wing to attack the enemy's left flank, while the commander's own left flank hid itself and guarded against an attack on the center. The military proverb says, quote, "He who judges himself inferior should advance his right wing against his enemy's left." This is the second formation. The third formation was considered to be a last resort. It assumed that the left was stronger than the right, and thus used the left flank to attack the enemy's right wing as a supplement to cavalry, all while the right remained in safety. The military proverb says, quote, "If your left wing is strongest, you must attack the enemy's right," according to the third formation. The fourth formation used shock factor to its advantage and was essentially a massive charge by the entire army into the enemy's lines. Quote, "The general who can depend on the discipline of his men should begin the engagement by attacking both the enemy's wings at once," the fourth formation. The fifth formation was an adaptation of the fourth formation. It was essentially the same as the fourth formation, but placed archers and light infantry in front of the center, protecting the center from a counterattack. The military proverb says, quote, "He whose light infantry is good should cover his center by forming them in front and charge both the enemy's wings at once." This is the fifth formation. The sixth formation was similar to the second formation. It involved an attack from behind on the enemy's left flank. The military proverb says, quote, "He who cannot depend on either the number or courage of his troops, if obliged to engage, should begin the action with his right and endeavor to break the enemy's left, the rest of his army remaining formed in line perpendicular to the front and extended to the rear like a javelin." This is the sixth formation. The seventh formation was used when the Romans were outnumbered. The left flank would use terrain to protect itself, while the right flank would be protected by light infantry and cavalry. The military proverb says, quote, "If your forces are few and weak in comparison to the enemy, you must make use of the seventh formation and cover one of your flanks either with an eminence, a city, a sea, a river, or some protection of that kind." Alright, now that I have overloaded you with information about the Roman military, let's see it in action in one of Caesar's most famous battles, the Battle of Alesia. In 52 BC, Caesar was almost finished conquering all of Gaul, or modern-day France. However, only one thing was in his way. A Gaul named Vercingetorix had united most of the Gallic tribes to fight against Caesar. After fighting a few engagements with the Romans, Vercingetorix found himself in 60,000 Gallic warriors on top of a fortified hill in the town of Alesia. So what did Caesar do? Well, he decided to play a war of attrition with Vercingetorix. He decided to starve him. So Caesar built a wall around the city. Practically overnight, the Gauls looked out on a 12 feet high, 11-mile-long wall trapping them in. However, when a few Gallic cavalrymen escaped the wall, Caesar built another wall to surround the previous one. This wall was 14 miles long and was built in as short a time as the first. Despite launching many attacks against these walls, none of them were successful. The walls had their own defenses. There was a field of wooden blocks with iron hooks fastened to them, or stimuli. There were pits of wooden stakes, or liles. There were 2 trenches, a palisade, and long stretches of artificially made underwood, which was impenetrable. However, there was one section which was not protected by a wall. The siege worked very effectively and eventually led Vercingetorix to expel his horses and some of his men. However, Vercingetorix soon also had to expel the women and children from the town, believing the Romans would let them through, but they did not. and Vercingetorix did not let them back in either. Caesar writes in his commentary Gallic Wars, quote, "When these came to the Roman fortifications, weeping, they begged of the soldiers by every entry to receive them as slaves and relieve them with food. But Caesar, placing guards on the rampart, forbade them to be admitted." End quote. So the women and children starved in the fields between the two armies. Eventually, however, a relief army of Gauls led by Commius and Vercassilamanus arrived to reinforce Vercingetorix. While at first the relief army attacked Roman foraging parties, both armies were aware that only a decisive fight in open battle would determine a winner. On September 30th, Commius attacked the outer wall defenses of the Romans, and Vercingetorix attacked the inside wall, but the Romans were able to defend against these attacks. Caesar writes that while the fighting seemed to have no victor throughout the whole day, Germans who had been recruited to his army made one last charge on the Gallic army and were able to cut down all of the archers and force the Gauls back into the town. The next day, these attacks were renewed, but still made no progress against the Romans. Caesar writes that by the last day of fighting, there was great difficulty in defending each part of the line. Quote, "They engage on all sides at once, and every expedient is adopted. They flocked to whatever part of the works seemed weakest. The army of the Romans is distributed along their extensive lines, and with difficulty meets the enemy in every quarter." End quote. On October 2nd, Vercassilamanus attacked that one spot on the wall that was unable to be covered, and Vercingetorix assaulted the inner wall. Caesar realized that Vercassilamanus's attack would be hard to defend against and decided to pour as many reserves as he could into that area. He sent his most trusted lieutenant, Titus Labienus, with 39 cohorts to defend the hall in the northwestern area of the battlefield. However, the Roman lines were close to breaking at this point, so Caesar took 6,000 cavalry and led them behind Vercassilamanus's rear and massacred the Gauls, and the Gauls broke after this. Caesar writes, quote, "His arrival being known from the color of his robe, and the troops of cavalry and the cohorts which he had ordered to follow him being seen, as these low and sloping grounds were plainly visible from the eminences, and the enemy joined the battle. A shout being raised by both sides, it was succeeded by a general shout along the ramparts and the whole line of fortifications. Our troops, laying aside their javelins, carry on the engagement with their swords. The cavalry is suddenly seen in the rear of the Gauls. The other cohorts advance rapidly. The enemy turn their backs. The cavalry intercept them in their flight, and a great slaughter ensues." End quote. And with that, the entirety of Gaul became conquered by Caesar. Weni, witty, wiki. Casualties for both sides are only estimates. There were likely anywhere between 12,800 to 60,000 losses by the Romans. However, there is no estimate of deaths of the Gauls. Some do estimate, however, that there were anywhere between 40,000 and 180,000 Gauls captured by the Romans. In conclusion, the reason we study Roman military tactics is because they were, without a doubt, one of the best fighting forces in the world. Great generals like Caesar won battle after battle, overcoming at times what seemed like impossible odds. So at the end of the day, Ave Caesar. And thanks for watching.